For now, the latest from China, where the Chinese Red Cross estimates that between 2,000 and 2,500 people have been killed this weekend as the army moved in to suppress the student demonstration.
Last night, an estimated 30,000 Chinese army troops were sent into the capital to crush what the government called a small band of hooligans and gangsters. Some lost their lives when armored personnel carriers and troop trucks simply ran over them. Others were gunned down as they tried to resist the savage show of force.
Chinese college students took a stand for democracy in Tiananmen Square following the death of Hu Yaobang, a communist reformer they revered. The conflict reached a tipping point on June 4, 1989, when the People's Liberation Army massacred thousands of protesters. Political reforms in China halted, strengthening both the Chinese economy and Communist Party. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China. China was now a communist country after a 20-year civil war in which Mao led an army of peasants, overthrowing the national government. This was seen as a triumph for many Chinese citizens who viewed the Communist Party as the party of the people. The United States would not recognize a communist China for the next 30 years.
30 years, the most populous country, right, in the world, right? Simply ignored by the United States.
In 1966, in an attempt to strengthen this power and the economy, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. It was a campaign led by students against capitalism and urban culture. The 10-year campaign helped shape the image of China as a repressive, militaristic regime that would even use force against its own people. In 1967, Mao used the People's Liberation Army to crush an industrial revolt, killing thousands in the process. Mao died and the revolution ended in 1976. In 1979, the U.S. opened diplomatic relations with China. China began to train outside of the Soviet bloc once again. The economy began to thrive under market socialism. Western products flowed into China and wages doubled, pushing it away from the bland era of Maoism.
After 1978, after China opened its door, suddenly many things from the West, right, flooded China.
However, at the same time, the younger generation became more disconnected with the Communist Party of their parents. This, combined with economic strain caused by runaway inflation and new Western democratic ideas, built the fault lines between the Chinese youth and peasantry and the communist government that would soon erupt. Early signs of conflict showed as demonstrations in Hefei occurred.
There was another student movement earlier in 1987, and that also originated from what we call USTC, but that was kind of local in the area that USTC located in a city called Hefei, Anhui.
On April 15, 1989, Hu Yaobang, General Secretary of the Communist Party, died and thousands of students came to mourn his death. He had pushed for reform inside of the party and his death symbolized a step back in progress for the students. 3 protesters kneeled before the Great Hall asking for 3 things: that students could pay last respects, that Li Peng have a dialogue with the student protesters, and that the students' activities be published in newspapers. No one in the government responded to their requests. The students were shocked as the events played out before them. Many more watched awestruck on TV.
And his death triggered the student protests. Right? Yeah, for many students, he's the advocate of democracy, of freedom, right? In 1986 and early 1987, right? And he was a kind of a symbol, right, of the democracy.
The protests swelled to thousands of people by April 21st. On April 22nd, the protesters created a memorial to Hu Yaobang despite warnings of punishment. They also requested to speak to Li Peng, but their petition was rejected. On April 23rd, students from 21 universities formed the Autonomous Federation of Beijing University Students to coordinate the protests and call on commoners for support. Then, on April 26, protesters were taken aback when the People's Daily, a state-run newspaper, published an article titled "The Necessity for a Clear Stand Against Anarchy," later retitled "The Necessity for a Clear Stand Against Turmoil." It reflected the views expressed by Deng Xiaoping, China's unofficial leader, and accused the protesters of rejecting the Communist Party.
Turmoil, that's a bad word, right? The government did not call this as a movement, democratic movement. They call this as a turmoil. Political turmoil should be suppressed, right? That's why after the editorial was published, the students have then, right, became more and angry, right, against the government. So more students, right, came up and, to the Tiananmen Square.
Protests escalated as students from Beijing University marched into the square where they were physically confronted by a police barricade. A week later, tens of thousands of students across 5 cities staged the largest protest in communist Chinese history. On May 13th, students began an indefinite hunger strike in Tiananmen Square ahead of the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's arrival. They hoped this event would help the protest gain political support. 2 days later, Gorbachev arrived. Plans to welcome him in the square were cancelled by the protests embarrassing the government. Hungry students began to eat again, but they did not leave the square. Thousands of students joined the protesters. They were growing angry with the government and calling for resignation of Deng Xiaoping. They wore headbands quoting Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death." Zhao Zhan, Hu Yaobein's replacement, visited the square on May 19th, trying to placate the students, promising more communication and reform. There was hope amongst the students, but it was too little too late. The next day, several districts of Beijing were placed under martial law, and troops moved in to enforce the order.
It was late at night in Beijing. This morning, our time, additional troops from the People's Army were ordered to move into the city.
We know that Beijing was under curfew law.
So we heard the broadcaster said the government had imposed a curfew, not a curfew, martial law on the Tiananmen Square.
And I slept in Tiananmen Square for several nights, and it was really cold at night.
At night, only about 30 or 35 degrees. At night, very cold. So at night we just wore those and coat.
And we have nothing. Like the whole square was just tents after tents.
I was most impressed by what is not by the presence of hundreds of thousands of students, but by the millions, about 1 to 2 million local people. They surrounded the Tiananmen Square, tried to protect those people during the martial law several nights. We didn't have to worry about our food. Lots of people donated food. I stayed there for about 5 nights on the Tiananmen Square. Right? Those 5 nights, the whole 5 days, I slept a total about 10 hours. I was lucky, right? If I stayed there 10 more days, I would not be here. Right? I wouldn't have been here.
On June 2nd, troops retreated from the square, creating a celebratory mood, which then changed to a hushed feeling of anxiety. Li Peng held a meeting with higher-ranking party officials planning a military takeover of the square. Later the same day, Deng Xiaoping gave the order to execute the plan. At 6 p.m. on June 3rd, the government made an announcement telling people to stay off the streets of Beijing and stay away from Tiananmen Square. On the night of June 3rd, the People's Liberation Army began to move towards the center of Beijing. Communist leaders told the People's Liberation Army to fire on people who got in the way. The massacre stretched into the early hours of June 4th, and sporadic shooting occurred throughout the day. When the dust settled, an estimated 2,400 were dead, along with hope for a democratic China in the near future. Many Chinese people and others around the world were shocked and horrified, but the communist government quickly came forth to hail the military intervention as a great victory and claim that no one was shot dead in the square itself. It also published an editorial warning that the army would mercilessly punish any people who planned riots or tried to disturb the social order. The government attempted to suppress and control information coming out about the massacre, but there were acts of defiance. A university radio station reported on the death toll, saying it was in the thousands. The massacre had an immediate impact on Chinese foreign relations. The US and other countries quickly imposed sanctions, including on sales of military equipment. The World and Asian Development Banks halted lending to China. Shortly after, the Soviet Union underwent a massive shift and world communism crumbled as the United States became the world's predominant superpower. Instead, the massacre ultimately strengthened the one-party system and stunted political reform. It also set China on a path of economic development that would lead them to become a world economic superpower. 27 years later, the Communist Party has not collapsed, nor has it softened or undergone any significant political reform. The Tiananmen Square massacre is a black mark on Chinese history that its government tries to ignore and cover up. Now the government employs 2 million people in its censorship division, which blocks any arrangement of the massacre's date, 6/4. Despite all this, efforts to push China towards democracy exist today in groups like the National Endowment for Democracy and others that keep the dream alive. The students protested in an effort to bring democracy to their country. They stood strong as the government cracked down on the protests, killing thousands of them. The massacre shocked the world, but the Chinese Communist Party was relentless. The country has not made political reform since 1989, despite efforts for reform from citizens in other countries. The students did not achieve their goal, but their bravery and sacrifice will never be forgotten.